Very warm welcome to you all to this IISS webinar entitled Turmoil in the Red Sea, Assessing the Houthis' Strategic Agenda. My name is Hassan. I'm the Senior Fellow for Middle East Policy at the IISS. I'm based in Bahrain. And it's my absolute pleasure to be moderating today's important and interesting session. Now, the Ansarullah, or the Houthis, drew a lot of international attention in recent months, first by launching missiles and UAVs at Israel, and then by attempting to impose a blockade on Israel on account of its war in Gaza by intercepting international shipping and merchant vessels that the movement deemed one way or another linked or associated with Israel. And while most discussions have focused on the Houthis' Red Sea attacks and the relationship of these attacks with the war in Gaza and with other regional dynamics, particularly dynamics between Israel and Iran, we'd also want to focus the discussion on the relationship of the Houthis' activities in the Red Sea to Yemen's internal dynamics and how those attacks could impact on Yemen's stalled peace process and how they fit into the Houthis' domestic strategic calculations. The Red Sea escalation has arguably interrupted peace talks between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis, which were already quite complicated over a variety of issues and over perceptions that these talks did not necessarily include a wider array of parties and factions that are parties to this conflict. The roadmap for peace in Yemen therefore faces an uncertain future. And the southern question, among many others, continues to remain unresolved, with various factions coming to head in various parts of Yemen. I'm joined today by Hamad al-Basha, who's a senior analyst with the Navanti Group, where he oversees teams working on issues such as food security, risk analysis, and emerging threats in the Arabian Peninsula. We're also joined by Nedwat Dosari, a non-resident scholar with the Middle East Institute and a fellow at the Center on Armed Groups, and my colleague at IISS, Wolf Christian Pius, who is the Senior Fellow for Armed Conflict in Europe, where he leads research on the impact of sanctions and other diplomatic instruments in ending violent conflict. So, as a reminder, today's event is on the record. The event will primarily be run as a conversation, where I'll be asking speakers to respond to various questions. In the meantime, please feel free to pose questions using the Q&A function in Zoom, and I'll make sure to weave them into this conversation as we go along. So I'll begin by asking Hamad a question about how you see these events in the Red Sea, primarily the Houthis' escalation in the Red Sea. First of all, what could you tell us about the Houthis in general? And maybe very quickly about how the Houthis have evolved over time and their place within Yemen's landscape at the moment. And maybe a word or two about how you think the recent events in the Red Sea and the Houthis' escalation there tie into the Houthis' goals and calculations within Yemen at the moment. Over to you.
Thank you for hosting us. We always appreciate an event that talks about Yemen. It's always a pleasure to join Wolf and Nadwa. The Houthis started their background. The Houthi is a family from Sa'da. It's a family of Zaidi clerics. Their history prior to 2004 was a history of a family that preached and worked on reviving Zaidi sect in Yemen. It's the dominant sect in northwestern Yemen. So the Houthi family in the Hussein al-Houthi, the founding father of the Houthi movement that we know today, initially it was called the Young Believers in the late 90s. The Young Believers was a movement that initially started to counter the growth of the Salafi movement in Sa'da and in northern Yemen. So it was more of a revival of the cultural identity of the Zaidis itself. And in 2004, there was a fallout between them and the government. Back then, late President Saleh, that began the 2004 to 2010 insurgency. In 2004, Hussein al-Houthi was killed His brother then took over Abd al-Malik, who is still the leader today. Some aspects of the movement is it's a young movement with all its leadership are under the age of 50. So most of the leaderships are in their 30s and 40s. Another aspect of the movement is this is a movement that for the past 2 or 3 decades have been engaged in an armed conflict with the central government and with various religious and tribal groupings. This is a movement that today sees itself as unstoppable, mainly because from 2004, 2010, they were able to combat the counterinsurgency campaign by the Saleh government, which was backed by Saudi. And then from 2015 to 2022, they were able to weather the Saudi-led coalition backed by the West and by the US. And then today they are challenging heads-on the UK and the US and the EU navies in the Red Sea. So it's in their mindset is that we are in the right side of history. There's a divine intervention behind their growth and success. Where is the situation today? Today is it seems that the Houthis, there's competing narratives in the country. There's a narrative that's not happy with how the Houthis have hijacked the stance towards Gaza. And in the majority of the regional and global audience now does not differentiate between the Houthis and between the government, the recognized government, or the rest of the population that's opposing the Houthis. The Houthis control around 30% of the territories, but more than 70% of the population. And so you have a situation where you're seeing that anyone who opposes the Houthis now is being accused of being pro-Israel or anti-Gaza, and vice versa. And so they have that for them, and they also have the aspect of being the underdog, of being someone who, the poor kid in a very rich neighborhood that was able to push back at the US and the Saudi and the central government. And we are in this situation today where they are effectively have managed to curtail US and UK and Israeli ship traffics going and sailing through the Red Sea and Arabian Sea.
So just to follow up on the point you've made about the way the Houthis have managed to really exploit their activity in the Red Sea to position themselves as potentially the most salient, visible actor in Yemen. Do you see the Houthis in the Red Sea as being purely ideologically motivated, or do you see them more as opportunistic actors in the Red Sea that are trying to exploit the war in Gaza in order to make those gains that you describe? In other words, or could it be a confluence of the two, in the sense that this is ideologically compatible with the Houthis' broader ideological beliefs and also serves a tactical purpose? But and I guess, the question is, do you think the Houthis would have done this if on ideological grounds if they didn't necessarily perceive a tactical gain to be made?
Yeah, so one of the shortcomings of the opposing forces and rival groups for the Houthis is they undermine their ideology in whatever they're doing. So the Houthis really believe in what they're doing from an ideology perspective. Their founding father, Hussein al-Houthi, in his writings, Malazim, the books that he wrote, he did foreshadow such a battle in the Red Sea against the US and against Israel and against the West. So this is something that it has become a self-fulfilling prophecy, but they're also very smart. They know that this is benefiting them from a current affairs tactical point of view. There was a lot of tensions domestically before the Gaza conflict. And by them deflecting on the economic challenges that they were facing, they're able to, again, because the key component for what's on the Houthi side is their ability to lead conflicts and lead wars and fight wars. And so you had the Saleh Wars, you had the 2010 Saada Wars, then you had the Saudi-led coalition. And when that was ending, previously they will always tell their supporters and the population under their control is like, you cannot ask me for salaries, you cannot ask me for benefits, you cannot ask me for this and that. We're engaging in war. And so when there was a ceasefire between the Saudi-led coalition and the Houthis, There was some pressure asking about, the salaries and, all these economic and day-to-day and service provisions. And the Houthis, the Gaza conflict has given them an opportunity to deflect. And in this week, we have a situation where Khalid al-Arasi is one of a public servant who's a Facebook activist and a writer who is a Houthi supporter, but he's been talking about corruption and he's been detained for speaking against mismanagement and bad governance. And then now you see the Houthis saying, we're engaging in a fight against Israel and against America. This is not a time to talk about corruption. This is not a time to talk about mismanagement. This is the time that we're engaging in fight. So it's like from one conflict to another conflict that doesn't seem to end. So it's both, to answer your question. It is an ideology. Abdul Malik believes that he is, and their movement and the people of Yemen are the saviors of Jerusalem and Palestine. But they also are very smart by using this to cement their power domestically and regionally.
Thank you very much. Moving on to you, Nedwa. How would you describe the Houthis' strategic goals in Yemen at the moment? Are they looking to dominate the country? And do you see them as coming out of their involvement in the Red Sea post-October 7 as being in a more favorable position, perhaps along the lines that Hamid has described? You're on mute.
Sorry. The Houthis have strategic goals, but not just within Yemen. The Houthis are a transnational movement. They're part of Iran's axis of resistance, and they do share a vision for the region. And I think that's one of the things that are often neglected. The Houthis want to control all Yemen. That's something they have explicitly said and committed themselves to. And they still say that. And their goal is to take Yemen and push into Mecca and liberate Jerusalem, along with Iran and axis of resistance. So the Red Sea attacks were, and Muhammad is right, I mean, the Houthis have used the attacks very smartly, very intelligently, to sort of cement their power within the country, repress, and that's something that they've done before, repress opposition or critics, excuse themselves from providing services to the people. And more important than that, they have taken advantage of the Red Sea and the situation in Gaza to recruit fighters. So that's their strategic goal. The Houthi strategic goal right now is to recruit fighters for their future wars. Abdul Malik al-Houthi himself, the leader of the movement, said that they have recruited 200,000 fighters since October 7th. I don't know if the number is right, but that's what he said. So I think it's important to pay attention to their regional, and you said earlier that the Houthis are trying to position themselves as the most effective actor in Yemen. They have proven themselves as the most effective actor in Yemen, thanks to their, their opponents who are fractured. But their goal is to prove that they are the most effective actor within the axis of resistance and regionally.
So Nedwa, how did the Houthis become the effective actor that they are, and how did they really manage to overcome a large number of opposing factions that have regional support from Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the Saudi-led coalition? And I've heard it being said that one of the major turning points, including by General Tariq Saleh about a month ago, that one of the major turning points was the Stockholm Agreement, and that event essentially allowed the Houthis free rein in conducting a lot of their activities, and essentially allowed them to bounce back from and to really roll back some of the losses that they had made. Would you agree with that narrative? And if so, what lessons do you think can or are being learned as to how to confront and face an adversary such as the Houthis?
Yes, I agree with that, but it's not just that. It's a number of factors. Factor number one is Iran's investment in the Houthis, which has been effective, strategic, and really good. Iran empowered the Houthis with knowledge, with training, with arms, with mentoring. Houthis can function without Iran. Now, 15 years ago, they couldn't. Okay. At the same time, not only Houthi opponents, not only the government, but also the Saudi-led coalition who disempowered their allies. The Emiratis and the Saudis have had conflicting agendas in Yemen. They have divided the anti-Houthi forces, and that division created a void that the Houthis filled and weakened the Yemeni government side against the Houthis. So the Houthis succeeded mostly because their allies are fractured, and their allies are fractured because their backers have not empowered them. On the contrary, they have disempowered them. The Houthis opponent cannot function without the Saudi coalition. It's the opposite of the Houthis. They can function without Iran. So that's really important. So Iran and then the Saudi Emirati sort of divergent agendas in Yemen, which manifested in weakness of their allies, which helped the Houthis. But I absolutely agree. The UN and the international community have also empowered the Houthis. The Stockholm Agreement is just one example, but it's the most important example. And I was myself one of the opponents and critics of the Stockholm Agreement. And the international community pushed for it. And the interesting part, it was not about peace in Yemen. It was not even about the humanitarian situation, although humanitarian organizations were saying that if the government take the Harira seaport, there might be, it might affect the food entrance into the country. It was about punishing the Saudis, Mohammed bin Salman, for killing Jamal Khashoggi. So it's the international community, it's the UN, it's the US, it's the UK, who were just extremely short-sighted. So when the Stockholm Agreement was signed, Yemeni government forces were forced to be on the defensive. Since then, they've been on the defensive. And what the Houthis did after that, they took advantage of the agreement, regrouped, and they made massive military gains east of Sana'a, and now they're threatening Marib, which is the last stronghold of the government in the north.
So, Wolf Christian, can I ask you to pick up on the thread that pertains to the Houthis' relationship with Iran? Because as we've heard, although the Houthis may be able to continue to function without Iranian support, it's still, I think, as Nadwa has pointed out, been actually very instrumental in contributing to the Houthis' military and strategic success. Not to mention the broader regional picture, whereby the Houthis have placed themselves as potentially one of the most, or if not the most effective, component of the so-called axis of resistance. How would you characterize the relationship between the Houthis and Iran? Do you see it as a relationship of command and control, or is it simply an ideological alignment with support from one partner to another and with some degree of reciprocity? How would you characterize and describe that relationship?
Well, thank you very much for that question, Hassan. I think the relationship between Iran and the Houthis is poorly understood, particularly in North America and the West. There's always talk about the Ansarullah being an Iranian proxy, and one of the questions is, what does it really mean? I mean, who's a proxy? What does this mean? In my view, it's an alliance, as Nadwa has stated before. Iran has been an enabler of Ansarullah. Indeed, 15 years ago, they were a relatively marginal military movement in the mountains of Sada, where they have their power base, and now they are, as you're correctly saying, arguably the most active part of the axis of resistance, right? I mean, who saw that coming? I think most people, even when October 7th happened, were looking towards Lebanon as the next regional flashpoint, and not towards Southern Arabia. And that's really the sort of, if you wish, geopolitical change that they've made it to the forefront. it's not a command and control relationship. I think that's really a mistake that very often is being made, and which also is the challenge for a lot of the current peace initiatives. Because when people try to find a resolution to the Red Sea crisis, they talk to Tehran or they talk to Muscat, but they very rarely talk to the Houthis themselves. In the case of Tehran, out of the mistaken belief that if somebody in Tehran picks up the satellite phone and calls his counterpart in Sana'a or Sada or wherever, then the attacks would stop. I don't think that's the relationship. Yes, I'm fairly certain that Iran was informed about the Red Sea attacks, even though they could strongly deny it. Yes, Iran provides some of the equipment being used, has been providing all of the technical know-how for the attacks. I think that's totally understood. But they are not in control of the situation. They are an alliance. If you'd ask the Iranian government today what their relationship to the Houthis is, they would say they are our allies. And I think for once that's a correct statement. And if you're an alliance, you have a certain amount of influence over your partner, but you don't have command and control. And if Iran were to stop supplying weapons, financial support, and political support to the Houthis tomorrow, chances are that the Houthis would be able to go on for a very long time. Whereas, as Naval correctly says, if the Saudi-led coalition would stop supporting the Yemeni forces or the anti-Houthi Yemeni forces, they're likely going to crumble within weeks, if not days. So, I mean, that's really important to understood. It's an alliance. It's not a command and control relationship.
That's very useful. So, in a sense, can we, get into the weeds a little bit more of this relationship, especially when it comes to the tactical side of things? So I know, some of our colleagues at IISS, including Fabian Hens, for example, have been doing the meticulous work of looking at the Houthi strategic arsenal and tracing what components of that arsenal may or may not be coming from Iran. How do you see that relationship at the tactical level? I mean, to what extent are the Houthis dependent on Iran insofar as their strategic arsenal is concerned? What percentage, or what are the major systems that they have, be they ballistic missiles or UAV technology or cruise missiles or others that we know or we believe comes from Iran versus things that they may be able to develop domestically versus some of the things that they may have inherited from the stockpiles of the Yemeni armed forces. So, insofar as their strategic arsenal is concerned, how dependent would you say they are on support from Iran, but also in terms of the intelligence that and the ISR picture that they may be receiving from Iran? How significant is that for their ability to carry out their operations in your assessment?
Well, I think if you talk about the strategic arsenal, there has been a shift over the last 9 years. Basically, when the Houthis took over power in much of northern Yemen in 2014-15, they inherited a large part of previous army's weapon systems. And during the first couple of years of the civil war, those were the weapons they mostly were using against the enemies, both within and also, against ships in the Red Sea. We must not forget that these attacks on commercial ships are not actually the new development that some people think they are, but I mean, it's something the Houthis have been doing since at least 2016, 2017. It's just they were not Western ships at the time, right? They were Saudi ships, they were Emirati ships. And therefore there wasn't much of a recognition that the Houthis were in the business of attacking maritime targets. So at that time it was the old weapon system they inherited. I think by now those are mostly gone. Then there was a time when missiles in particular and UAV systems were imported directly from Iran. I think there's been ample evidence, let's say in 2016-17, that complete weapon systems were being smuggled. And now the problematic development is that the Houthis are increasingly able to manufacture their own weapon systems. I mean, they're sophisticated weapon systems, right? So basically, we see 4 major weapon systems being used: ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, UAVs, suicide drones, and basically drone boats, what we call WBIDs, waterborne improvised explosive devices or UAS. The ballistic missiles these days are manufactured to a significant extent in Yemen. So that's really different from, let's say, 6, 7, 8 years ago. Yes, certain components are still being smuggled, engines in particular, electronics, some other parts, but most of the manufacturing takes place in Yemen. The cruise missile systems, which are arguably the most sophisticated and dangerous weapon system, are being smuggled as far as we can tell. So they're still being brought in components and just put together in Yemen. But I mean, there's not any domestic manufacturer. The drones have been Yemeni made with very few exceptions for the last couple of years. So that's a less new development. And so are the drone boats. So out of the 4 sort of strategic weapon systems that they use, certainly in the Red Sea, I would say 3 are now predominantly manufactured inside of Yemen, with the one exception being cruise missiles. And actually, if you look at the attack pattern over the last couple of months, you can tell that we see fewer cruise missile attacks and more drone attacks. And Bashar and I actually had a discussion about this a couple of weeks ago. A likely reason for that is that the stocks of cruise missiles are starting to run low because they need to smuggle them, and eventually you're out. And smuggling, of course, is not super easy. So that's basically the strategic side. In terms of the arsenal, in terms of ISR capabilities, I think that's where arguably the Houthis rely even more on the Iranians than for the actual weapon systems. One crucial challenge has always been for them to identify the targets in the Red Sea, because Yemen does not have a lot of radar capabilities left. So there are reasons to believe that a certain Iranian vessel that has been parked in the southern Red Sea, the Peshat at the moment, but there were other vessels before that. It's basically a ship that is presented as a commercial civilian vessel, has been sitting for months at the same position in the Red Sea, and it's generally considered to be an intelligence ship. It's very, very likely that this ship and others play a role in acquiring intelligence to facilitate the attacks. That's really, there is a gap in the Houthi capabilities.
Thank you, Wolf Christian. So maybe moving on to how all of this impacts the Yemen peace process. Hamad, I wonder whether I could ask you to maybe give us an update as to where the Yemen peace process currently is. I recall there was quite a bit of optimism late last year when some of the factions seemed to be able to come together to address, for example, the Safar potential ecological disaster that could have happened in the Red Sea. And with the announcement of a roadmap for peace. Where is the peace process at the moment? What is the status of talks between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis? Is all of this on hold at the moment because of the escalation in the Red Sea? Or do you see those efforts as ongoing?
The 800-pound gorilla in the room is the aspect of that the Houthis do not recognize the internationally recognized government of Yemen and their forces as a peace partner. And it seems that everybody who's involved in the process are not really accepting the fact that the Houthis do not accept that, that one day they're going to form a coalition government or a peace government or unity government with President Al-Alimi or the members of the Presidential Leadership Council. So that's to me is the main issue, is that the Houthis don't recognize the local or the international recognized government as a peace partner. They're more focused on the Saudis because it's a Saudi-led coalition. But the Saudis are seeing their role today as being more of a go-between, a mediator. And I think initially the Ansarullah or the Houthis are not we're not recognizing the Saudis' role as a go-between, but it seems that could be an option, as a first step. But today, the fact that the peace process is UN-led, I don't see how US or the UK or the French will support a peace agreement with the Houthis while the maritime attacks are ongoing. I see the peace agreement as a reward for if the Houthis are willing to sign a peace agreement and commit to a transition process. But while the maritime attacks is happening, I don't see that there's an appetite in London, Paris, or in DC to reward the Houthis for the maritime agreements. So for now, I think the envoy, the US-led, the US peace, the US envoy and the UN envoys are continuing the discussions to cement the details of the roadmap. The roadmap, there's a big part of the roadmap have been there's consensus on it, and I think that once the maritime operations stop and things calm down in the region, if the conflict and if Israel's war in Gaza stops, then we could have at least a starting point. So it did not die; it's in pause. It's in the starting point. But long term, I don't see how. I have to agree with Nadwa that Ansarullah and the Houthis they want to run the country from Saada all the way to Aden, from Al-Makha all the way to Mahara without a coalition from the international recognized government. So it's we're still
So I think, so building on that point, I mean, Nadwa, if I can come to you, given the Houthis' unwillingness to recognize other partners on Yemen's political landscape and along the lines that Hamid has described, and given the fact that the peace process seems to be primarily in reality between the Saudis and the Houthis, and somewhat imposed, or at least the PLC, the Presidential Leadership Council, seems to be somewhat sidestepped in the process. Given these complaints from some of the other factions, political factions in Yemen, to what extent do you think these other factions are able to spoil or shape or mold the Yemen peace process? Will they simply have to spectate and sit back and accept it as a fait accompli? Or will they be able to rely on perhaps regional partnerships with regional players that might not fully be on board with the Saudi UN peace process in Yemen in order to spoil or shape this process? You're on mute.
Again, sorry. I don't think that this should be called a peace process. It's not a peace process. It's the Saudi-Houthi negotiations. There's a huge difference between the two. And it's not a Yemen peace process. It's a political agreement between the Saudis and the Houthis. And the PLC would be brought in and sort of pressured to sign on it because, again, the Saudis and the Emiratis have disempowered their allies. And so they have that leverage to force them to sign the deal. It's not the Yemeni government or the PLC that's going to spoil the agreement. It's the Houthis that they will do. And, their track record speaks of that, speaks for them. So if the Saudis want to get this agreement because they want to leave, they want to extricate themselves out of Yemen because the Saudis want to focus on their domestic priorities, Vision 2030 and all, and the Houthis want to get the most out of the agreement before they also get the Saudis out of the way, which is one of the Houthis' objectives. Now, the Houthis are strategic. They get the Saudis out of the way. The next step is they want to take all Yemen. And since the beginning of the truce, the Houthis have been mobilizing forces. They have manufactured arms. They've been positioning themselves. They have recruited fighters. And so they're preparing for when the Saudis are out, they're going to escalate and take Yemen, the rest of Yemen. So it's not the rest of the forces that will be spoilers. It's the Houthis. I think other PLC leaders have said we are willing to enter an agreement with the Houthis and have a sort of like political transition, but provided that there is a partnership, which Mohammed is right. The Houthis do not recognize any of these leaders. They don't recognize the PLC. They don't recognize the Yemeni government. They deem them mercenaries. So, the spoiler would be the Houthis. But when you look at the Houthis and how they perceive this peace process, quote unquote, for the Houthis, this is a peace process between them as the only representatives of Yemenis. This is how they see themselves, and the Saudis.
So here's a cynical follow-up question for you, Nadwa. What if hypothetically, the negotiations lead to fruition, the Saudis disengage from Yemen and focus on their own domestic development, and let's say the Houthis do take over Yemen one way or another. To what extent do you think the Houthis' ambitions could be limited to Yemen, meaning that the conflict becomes a lower intensity conflict, becomes primarily a local conflict within Yemen, and not so much as a regionalized or internationalized conflict? And in a way, the Houthis, now that they're in control in Yemen, in this hypothetical situation, become more inclined to attempt to govern and essentially become, a normal, I don't know if normal is the right word, but at least become tempered in their ambitions to regionalize and internationalize the conflict, and ultimately resulting in a situation that could be fairly livable for regional and international players. Do you think that's possible at all, or do you see the Houthis' alignment with Iran's axis of resistance and the broader ideological designs that you described early on, their ambitions towards Jerusalem and so on, as leading them to become somewhat incorrigible in reality, that even if they end up taking in Yemen, their ambitions would continue to remain regional. They will still and will not focus simply on ruling and governing Yemen.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the Houthis will become a responsible state actor if they take Yemen. I mean, there were theories that if the Houthis take the north, they'll be happy with the north. If they take Yemen, they'll be happy and they will become a responsible state actor. If the Houthis had the potential to become a responsible state actor, they would have been already. They control most of the population. The north, they've inherited the entire state, state in the north, the bureaucracy and everything. Yet they failed to act as a responsible state actor. They don't provide services. They don't provide salaries. They're extremely oppressive, et cetera, and they continue to escalate. Every ceasefire opportunity has been an opportunity for the Houthis to escalate and expand militarily. The Houthis' ambition are not Yemen, they're beyond Yemen, and that goes back to their ideology. And even if Iran decides that they want to de-escalate, the Houthis are a creature of their own. They have become independent. They are independent. Yes, they're allies with Iran, but they also have their own, not only regional, but also global ambition. They want to take Mecca, they want to take Jerusalem, they want to lead the Islamic world, and they want to expand Islam across the world. And so I don't think that the Houthis will become a responsible actor. The only way for the Houthis to become a responsible actor, and you asked me earlier what lessons were learned from the Stockholm Agreement, is for the Houthis to know that force and violence is not going to work for them. So as long as the balance of power is in their favor, they'll continue to expand. And they also believe that God is on their side. Everything that happened since 2014 reinforced that idea that God is on their side and that He's helped them come this far. They were a guerrilla fighters, like in the north, remote mountains of Yemen. They took Sana'a. They took most of Yemen at some point, and they defeated the Saudis. They defeated the Emiratis. They're now taking on the Americans and the Israelis and the entire Western world. So why would they stop?
So, Wolf Christian, Mohammed made the point that with the current escalation in the Red Sea at the moment, that players, UN Security Council members, the US, the UK, France, and others are unlikely to support and lend their assistance to the Yemen peace negotiations. But in a sense, we also see the Saudis seemingly trying to protect that process by sitting out Operation Prosperity Guardian, by having nothing to do with Poseidon Archer, the US-UK strikes on the Houthis. Do you see the Red Sea as a spoiler event for the peace process, either because it changes the Houthis' calculations, or because it makes international partners less willing, or because of Saudi Arabia's role in intercepting reportedly some of the Houthi projectiles that crossed into its airspace on the way to Israel? How do you see the relationship between the peace negotiations and the Red Sea, and particularly focusing on the international dimension and on the willingness of Western nations, essentially, to push forward and support the peace negotiations?
I think that's a great question. I think the challenge that we're seeing is that in a sense these are two different discussions. So you have the military discussion about the Red Sea, right? Protecting global trade, protecting the freedom of navigation, and a certain willingness to provide a kinetic response, by the US, by the UK, by some other states, to some extent by the European Union. And then you have the political process in Yemen, or rather on Yemen, because as Nadwa has totally correctly said, it's not negotiations between Yemeni parties, it's negotiations between the Houthis and the Saudis first and foremost. And I've been actually asking this question recently. Said so. I mean, to Western policymakers, where's the connection between your military strategy for the Red Sea and your political strategy? And the short answer is there is no connection, right? So the people who are working on the peace process, for lack of a better word, I mean, they are still saying what they've been saying for the last 6 years that I've been following Yemen. Peace is just around the corner. It's just a couple of more days, breakthrough. We have a roadmap. We've agreed on 98% of the roadmap. I think Mohammed made that point. Tiny issues like the payment of salaries needs to be resolved, but then we can sign and everything will be fine. And what I think is not being seen by a lot of people in the policy community is that the threat potential that the Houthis show in the Red Sea at the moment, they will continue to show, right? So even if a peace agreement is being signed between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis, the Yemeni will retain the Houthis in Yemen will retain the capability to conduct these strikes, right? I mean, whether again in the Red Sea or against Saudi Arabia or other states, as long as they retain the strategic arsenal, they will use this as a political weapon. That's what the Houthis have been doing consistently. Their attacks on international ships, or in the past on Saudi Arabia and the UAE, were political attacks. They were not designed to do maximum damage, right? I mean, they did do damage, and the Houthis are willing to live with that risk. But the idea is not to really score military points. It's about scoring political points, about showing that they can project power far away from Yemen. And I think we can safely assume that they will continue to do that. So even if there is a peace agreement, if another issue comes up where the Houthis are not happy with the international response, they will use their arsenal again to make similar points. And I think that's really the relationship between the Red Sea and the peace process, that we see what the Houthis are willing to do, how they think, but somehow the negotiations are not really taking this into account. I mean, every time I've talked to the special envoy or his people, or the US envoy, it's not like they don't see this issue, but somehow it doesn't factor into the negotiations. There's never any talk about, we must contain them to a certain extent. I mean, I think what we've learned from Yemen, what I've learned from Yemen is that if you want to negotiate with the Houthis, you need to do that out of a position of strength. And in some ways, Stockholm Peace Agreement was, where we lost that strength, right? Because I mean, basically, the international community, not just the coalition, has been on the defensive ever since. The Houthis see this as a sign from God that they are on the correct path, as Nadwa has been saying. And who's there to stop them, right? So in this situation, yes, there is prospect for a peace agreement. I mean, I think it's entirely possible something will be signed, but unless we reevaluate the way we deal with the Houthis as a military group. They will continue to do what they are doing now and what they've done since 2016 in terms of attacking neighboring countries. Every time they run into an issue where they don't get what they want.
So let me follow up on that with a question to all three members of the panel. And this ties into a question we received from the audience. And I think I know a question that I've been thinking about and have encountered in multiple discussions, and which links to the points you've been making, Wolf Christian, about the strategic gains that the Houthis have been able to make in the Red Sea and how unlikely they are to fully let go of that capability to activate that maritime front as a political lever that they can use in order to achieve whatever political gains might be in question. Now the question is, do you expect the Houthis to de-escalate, at least tactically, or to stop their attacks in the Red Sea if we were to see a ceasefire in Gaza? My guess is that we would likely see, or we could very well see, a de-escalation and even a cessation of attacks during a ceasefire. Similar to what we saw Hezbollah do during the first ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, I think back in November, when other factions of the so-called axis of resistance unilaterally abided by and observed the ceasefire, primarily because I think Hezbollah was in somewhat of a particular situation and wanted to control the escalation and did not want to risk an all-out confrontation with Israel. But I think we also saw a lowering of activity across, because in a sense, I think the political effect of continuing to attack when the Palestinian factions are observing a ceasefire is dampened. Essentially, you could upset a ceasefire that Hamas and the Palestinian factions on the ground are abiding by. And I think that does not achieve the intended political effect. So, but that's not to say that the Houthis will completely forsake and get rid of that ability once and for all. What are your expectations? I mean, do you, maybe I'll start with you, Wolf, and then work backwards with Nedwa and Hamad. Do you expect the Houthis to significantly scale down or even stop their activity in the Red Sea if we were to see a ceasefire in Gaza?
Well, I think it depends a little bit on what kind of form such a ceasefire would take. I mean, I think the Houthi ask is the withdrawal of IDF forces from Gaza, not a ceasefire, right? I mean, that's what they say is the short-term goal. I think it's very unlikely that we're going to see a withdrawal of IDF forces from Gaza at this stage. I mean, that's not on the table. So, I mean, in that sense, their demand would not have been met. Would they still reduce the level of activity? I think to some extent we're seeing that already. I think we're already seeing a reduction in activity without obviously some sort of a ceasefire. Purely for technical reasons, right? I mean, I think they're running low on certain weapon systems. I mean, obviously the US operations have had an impact on the launching capabilities and maybe not as big as people expected them to be, but I mean, of course, it has done some damage. I would be surprised if we would see the Houthis sort of declaring a formal ceasefire in the Red Sea anytime soon, unless it was part of a broader agreement. But like I said before, even if they did, I don't think that would be the end of the threat potential, because as we've seen before, they've done this continuously over the years. So if they were to sign an agreement which would cover the Red Sea, chances are they would be back again at it in a couple of years at the latest, unless steps are taken to somehow control the strategic arsenal.
Nedwa?
Yeah, I agree. I think the Houthis are likely to stop the attacks if the Gaza war ends or ceasefire happens. But I think that would be tactical and temporary. And even if the war ends in Gaza, the Houthis will find reasons in the future to attack the Red Sea shipping. And that's because the Houthis realize that's also a leverage on the international community. Even though the Biden administration designated the Houthis, it was not the FDO designation, but also they don't care about the FDO designation. And what's happening now is that the US, the UK, the Europe, the UN are desperate to get the roadmap signed, and knowing that the Houthis will benefit from it, probably at the expense of the rest of Yemen. And also, even when the Houthis are attacking the Red Sea shipping. So the Houthis know that the more, they've learned that the more they escalate, the more leverage they gain. First, they gained on other Yemeni actors, and then they gained on the Saudi coalition, and now on the international, well, before the UN, and now the international community. And so they've learned that game. They're really good at it, knowing that there is very little appetite from the international community for escalation. And so I think, yes, this will be the Houthis, this threat will not end anytime soon. And the Red Sea has practically become a hostage to the Houthis.
Ahmed?
I want to go back and answer this question by also following up on something that Nadwa said. The difference between Ansarullah, the Houthis, and other members of the Axis of Resistance is two things. One, ideology. So when you look at Katab Hezbollah and Hezbollah in Lebanon, they believe in Wilayat al-Faqih. They believe in Khomeini and Khamenei are the leader of their revolution. That's not the case in Yemen. In Yemen, Ansarullah, they don't believe in Wilayat al-Faqih, so they don't recognize, they have respect to Khomeini and Khamenei's legacies, but they see Abdul Malik as the leader of the revolution. He is the wali. He is and this is even part of the chant when they pledge allegiance, is they pledge allegiance to him as the wali, as the leader. So that's one. The second thing is, Ansarullah do not receive financial support in cash directly, like Hezbollah or Katab Hezbollah in Iraq and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Both groups acknowledge, I think Hezbollah public number was $600 million that they were receiving annually from Iran. The Houthis, I agree with Nadwa, can survive without the support, technical support at this point with the from Iran. I think they already received all the transfer of knowledge of building the kits, and so it's not, I hate to say it's not rocket science. Rocket science have not become rocket science. But if today the war stops in Gaza, I think the Houthis, one aspect of the people who follow the Houthis and the opposition of the Houthis don't really take it serious is their public statements. So the Houthis publicly have said that that putting aside of what's happening in Gaza, that because US and UK attacked the Houthis and there's over 30 soldiers that were killed and wounded, that now they have there's vengeance, there's bloodshed between the Americans, the Brits, and the Houthis. So that's a different topic from what's happening between Israel and with the Gaza situation. So I think that's something that will flare on and off as needed, but also the Houthis publicly, in line with the Axis of Resistance, have said that American presence in the Red Sea is no longer wanted. And so they will continue to harass any presence of coalition warships in the Navy, UK and US Navy mainly, in the region until they push it out. And because of what happened in Afghanistan, they see that if you exert enough pressure, that sooner or later they will pull out. We're here, this is our land, we're staying, and we have the means and what they call the strategic patience, sabr al-strategy, for the long term to keep harassing the presence. Something else that I think that I was surprised to see the UN Security Council mention it, but following up on it is the Houthis may somehow figure out a mechanism where for you to pass by the Red Sea in Bab al-Mandab, you have to apply for a permit or get a license. So far, these permits are now used as a way to ensure that you don't get targeted, that you're verified as not a ship linked to the US, UK, or heading to Israel. But I think that, this permit mechanism there's a new office, a humanitarian office that was formed in the presidential office in Sana'a. I think that's one way that they're gonna also benefit financially from the traffic, sort of like Suez Canal is benefiting money. And I'm just here thinking out of the box. So in the short term, I agree with the panelists that yes, they may stop, but in the mid to long term, they have found the key to pressure the international community. Yes, they got attention from targeting Aramco. They got attention from targeting the airport in Abu Dhabi. They got attention from targeting foreign forces inside Yemen, but nothing compared to the attention they got from the maritime operations. So if you want to
Yeah.
learn about how to contain Yemen, I think a good start for us to be reading now is how is the world containing North Korea?
So you mentioned the economic and the financial gain that the Houthis may be trying to extract from their ability to threaten shipping in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And the economy is something that we touched on tangentially. But I wonder, Mohammed, if you could tell us, because we touched on it as well at the beginning, talking about some of the tactical gains, political gains that the Houthis may be deriving by deflecting attention away from some of Yemen's internal economic difficulties. I know there's been some degree of concern at the same time about some of the potential unintended consequences of the US terrorist designations of the Houthis that Nedwa mentioned. So yes, it wasn't a foreign terrorist organization designation, but an SDGT, specially designated global terrorist designation. But that also entails a number of sanctions and so on that could have, given that the Houthis are essentially governing territories where the majority of Yemen's population lives, could have broader repercussions. So since you follow Yemen's economy quite closely, I mean, how do you see it at the moment? And are you concerned about potential unintended consequences of broader sanctions on the Houthis, on Yemen's population?
So as of today, the shipments for wheat and flour continue to arrive. Year-over-year imports remain relatively stable. But there's an increase in cost due to the war premiums, and shippers in general are avoiding the Red Sea and also avoiding doing business in Yemen. The banks have decreased the credit lines for traders who are shipping food to Yemen due to concerns of repayment stemming from the security and financial challenges. That was even before the sanctions were started implementing, even though the SDGG is not as hurtful as the FTO, but Yemen is already a country in conflict and in war. So this just adds another layer of complexities, and exporters and traders and banks and financiers are just avoiding the Yemeni market in general. So the sanctions will add further complexities to the trade finance and business operations. Something else that's happening also is that the designations is scaring the diaspora and the expat community, who are, according to estimates of the World Bank, are sending between $3 to $4 billion a year. They're the unsung heroes that are, keeping the country afloat. When you look at how Yemeni families in Houthi-controlled areas haven't got paid salaries in public sectors for 7 to 8 months, how they're surviving? They're surviving because they have a relative, a cousin, a son, a father who's living in the Gulf or US and are sending money. So Western Union, I don't have an update on that, but at one point had disruptions in transfers and other mechanisms. Something else that's putting challenge in the whole trade and economic situation is the demarge. So the ability for ships before the sanctions from A to Z, it will take you 38 days for you to book the arrival of a ship to Hodeida's port. Now it's taking almost 50 days and around 80 days to book and receive the goods from Hodeidah. And these are stats and numbers that were from like a couple of weeks ago, and it could have most likely could have gotten worse. So one of the things that was that the Houthis were under a lot of pressure to pay salaries before the whole Gaza situation started. And I think I believe that the Houthis, had to have enough income from the land customs and tax borders. They have enough income from zakah, enough income from the port of Hodeidah, enough income from aviation, from telecom, from cell phone, from internet to pay symbolically even a monthly salary. But they didn't do it because they want the population to pressure the international community, to pressure the Saudis to commit to the 6 months or 12 months of paying salaries. And so they came very close to receiving those benefits. But then because of the whole situation in Gaza, things have derailed, and when things cool off, then you're going to see the population again, requesting the salaries. And it's interesting to see how the Houthis will say, we are the government, we're the republic, we represent the people of Yemen, except when it comes to the salaries, then they're like, oh no, this is the internationally recognized government is the one that's has obstructed it. And the past year, the internationally recognized government did not get any revenues from oils in Hadramaut and Shabwa because the Houthis bombed the oil terminals in Shamma and in Dabba. So they're not even able to make money. So they're really complicated, the economic situation for many reasons, mainly to pressure the Saudis to commit to paying the salaries. And if that will happen, I think sooner or later it will happen, but that's not a long-term solution. So what's next? What's the day after the 12 months end, and when the Saudis are not able to, or we're not willing to pay more salaries? What will the Houthis do to pressure the Saudis to do that? At what point do the Saudis just, unplug and let Yemen be Yemen, and deal with the consequences? So
I think the management of the economy has been such a tricky issue, because even when the Saudis, for example, have stepped in with underwriting, trade finance, and so on, that has, in order to enable Yemeni importers to import basic goods, you had inflationary effects, and the value of the Yemeni riyal in government-controlled areas fell significantly by comparison to the Yemeni riyal issued by the Central Bank of Sana'a, the old notes in Houthi-controlled areas, and so on. So it has been a very, I think, complex and tricky issue to manage. One of the other points we have alluded to tangentially is the role of regional powers. And I think the relationship and the involvement of regional powers, unlike international players, they simply can't totally disengage. Ultimately, Yemen is a border country for some of them. And even if the Houthis were to de-escalate in the Red Sea, and even if we were to see international Western disengagement from the Red Sea, then for regional players, it's still quite a different story. So, Nedwa, if given the point you made earlier, that in a sense, the Houthis are ultimately expansionists, that their ideological agenda is incorrigible, what do you think are the prospects for regional powers like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and so on, to have really an enduring and long-lasting peace agreement with the Houthis? And what's the alternative, really, in this case? And maybe in trying to answer that question, it would be great if you could shed light on where you see the UAE and Saudi Arabia as arguably the two most significant regional players in the UAE, in Yemen at the moment. Where do you see them as? Do you see them as, because they did seem to come together with some sort of power sharing agreement under the Presidential Leadership Council, but has that been delivering? And do you see them as primarily aligned or misaligned at the moment? And what courses of action do you think are open to them if the long-term prospect of peace with the Houthis is hopeless, as you suggest?
I don't think that the prospects for peace is hopeless if the right steps are taken. And right now, the wrong steps are taken. I think the Saudis are doing a strategic mistake by pushing for this roadmap that they know that the Houthis will benefit from. And the two regional countries need to know that they cannot shield themselves from Yemen. Yemen will eventually spill out. And Houthi-dominant Yemen is not going to be safe for the region and the world. I think what needs to happen, and the Houthis understand power and they respect power. They respect strength. Right now, everybody has come to the Houthis from a weak point. So without changing the military dynamics on the ground, where it is balanced, there is not going to be peace, and the Houthis are not going to stop. And so, yes, the Saudis and the Emiratis have worked, and they came to an understanding, and that manifested in the formation of the Presidential Leadership Council. Now, the Presidential Leadership Council are different forces that are not necessarily aligned 100%. There are some divisions within these forces. There are some rivalries, especially now in Hadramaut, with the Saudis trying to sort of prevent the SDC, the UAE-backed SDC, from expanding into the Al-Wadi region in Hadramaut, which shares 700-kilometer borders with Saudi Arabia. Having said that, these anti-Houthi forces are also united against the Houthis. That's something that they all understand, and they're all committed to. I have seen some improved understanding among these forces. There has been a joint military and security committee that was formed last year. There's been better coordination. And I think within these forces, there is sort of, relatively speaking, of course, informal understanding that everybody has their own turf. And right now, the Houthis are sort of, the threat to all of us. And I think these forces, the leadership of these forces, they understand also that the Red Sea attacks are an opportunity, because now the world sees the Houthis for who they are. Now the world gets it. Everything that the leaders of these forces have been saying since at least 2018, now the world understands it. So there is an opportunity there, and they want to take that opportunity. Again, the only way to contain the Houthis is to change the balance of power, military power on the ground. And only the Saudis and the Emiratis can do that, or make that happen, or help make that happen.
So thank you. Wolf Christian, when we talk about the region, we often talk about the UAE and Saudi Arabia, but Yemen has other neighbors as well, including the, let's say, broader neighborhood of East Africa and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, where, interestingly, we've seen a concurrent rise in piracy, it seems, with the uptick in Houthi activities. Do you see these two phenomena as being linked? Is it opportunistic activity by pirates to exploit the lack of security in the Red Sea, or are these dynamics completely disconnected from one another?
Thank you, Hassan. I think that's another great question. I think there is a link between what we see in the southern end of the Gulf of Aden. As you were saying, there has been a resurgence of piracy, quote unquote, not at the same level as we see in the Red Sea, but I mean a quite notable spike in attacks. And what's really interesting about this is how closely these acts appear to be linked, right? There was one specific incident where Somali pirates were on board of a ship in the southern Gulf of Aden. I think it was in November. The US Navy sent a warship, arrested the pirates, and then just a short while later, the Houthis launched ballistic missiles on the location of these two ships. And I mean, that's a degree of coordination that I don't think is purely opportunistic. What we do know about the linkages between Somalia and Yemen is that they're very close, right? And in the West, people tend not to see that, but I mean, everyone who's ever been to the Hadramaut area or to the Red Sea coast knows that there are very, very close relationships, commercial family relationships between, the two sides of the Horn of Africa. And what we also know is that the Houthis have been relying on Yemeni on Somali groups to provide them with some of the weapons. So a lot of the weapon smuggling from Iran is not directly from Iran to the Houthis, but it first goes to the Somali coastline, particularly the sort of northern and the Puntland and Somaliland coastline, and then it goes across. And those are criminal networks, right? So basically, the weapons are being delivered, of course, for political reasons, but the people who smuggle them from Somalia to Yemen are basically commercial people, right? It's a well-established trading network, and to some extent, they are the same people who have also been behind the piracy attacks. So it's basically warlords who've made this their business. There are some indications that maybe some money has found its way to these people in recent months to encourage them to take up their piracy operations, just to create a diversion, to create more trouble, while the focus is on the Red Sea. It's still very much under investigation, but I think we might see more of that than we're quite aware of. And it's quite interesting. I mean, the links between Iran and Yemen are well documented and much talked about. The links between weapons going from Iran to Somalia are much less discussed, right? And possibly because people don't see the sort of ideological link, because of course Al-Shabaab is a very different animal from the Houthis, but there has been a steady stream of weapons going from the same ports in Iran into Somalia, and quite possibly money and strategic ideas as well. And my final thought on the matter is, why do we still call it piracy, even though it looks in some ways very different from what we saw, let's say, 10, 15 years ago? Well, it's easier for Western nations to combat piracy than to combat terrorism, because that's what you would need to call it, right? So for the European Union, for example, it's easier to mandate a naval force to protect ships against piracy than to protect them against the kind of actions that the Houthis have been committing. And so there's some sort of an unspoken agreement in parts of the naval community to just, it's easier to keep calling it piracy without maybe looking a lot deeper, because that suits the interests of all sides.
So thank you very much for that. And with 3 minutes left, I'll ask maybe each one of our panelists if they have any concluding thoughts in about a minute or so, starting with you, Mohammed.
Closing remarks for me, Ruby, is that we sometimes try to solve problems, and maybe Yemen is one of those problems that just cannot be solved. Thank you.
Thank you. That's on that depressing note, over to you, Nadwa.
I think it's important for people to gain more understanding about the Houthis' ideology. This is what drives them more than anything else. And this is the one aspect that's often, if not always, neglected or totally dismissed by most analysts.
Thank you very much. And Wolf Christian.
Yeah, I wish I had a more positive outlook, but unfortunately I can't offer that. Just to follow up on a point that Mohammed has made. I mean, the interesting thing about the Houthis is that they behave very much like a state, yet at the same time they expect the international community to basically foot the bill for the provision of social services, for food assistance and such like. And the challenge we have, and I agree with Nadwa that one needs to negotiate with them from a position of strengths, it's very hard to project strengths in this environment, right? 100 years ago, it would have possibly an option to basically put the kind of blockade on Yemen where you would have the kind of starvation that would kick the Houthis from power. We can't do this anymore, right? Because the international community can't tolerate that level of suffering, and precisely because the Houthis control the majority of the population, we are under moral obligation to feed them. So much as we might disapprove whatever the Houthis are doing, WFP and NGOs and UNICEF and what have you will continue to pay the teachers, will continue to provide a certain level of assistance, just about enough to make sure that the situation doesn't get so dire that you would have a serious uprising against the Houthis. But at the same time, that makes it very, very difficult to project the kind of strengths that they would possibly understand.
So I'm actually less optimistic than you are, Wolf Christian, about how much suffering the international community is willing to tolerate, given the misery in Gaza. But
that's a different issue. I should have said, with the exception of Gaza, the international community is not willing to accept that. You're absolutely right, Hassan. Gaza is a special case.
On that note, it's been a real pleasure moderating this session, and I'm very, very grateful to Mohammed El-Basha and Edward Dosari and Wolf Christian for having joined us and for having spent their time and shared their thoughts with us. So thanks again very much, and thank you to everyone who attended this discussion, and we look forward to seeing you again in the very near future. Thank you, and bye-bye.